Right, so I wrote up a short little stint that helps us to kind of frame what this panel is going to be about and what we're going to discuss. So, yesterday was significant for many in this country. Of course, white liberals had been living in a nightmare for the past 4 years, most of them for the first time. It was an ugly, recurring nightmare, but make no mistake, it was one crafted from their hands. These 4 years were the inevitable product of a 500-year-long colonial project, a project forged in white supremacy, grounded in exploitative racial capitalism, and mobilized through a relentless oppression. A colonial project whose function relies on a combative otherization that promises a persistent enemy, the antithesis of the white, the wealthy, the capitalist, to be fought, controlled, and won over in the name of imperialist objectives, including indigenous peoples who were slaughtered in the name of colonial expansion, Black folks whose enslavement promised persistent capitalist exploitation, and Arabs villainized in an effort to maintain control of oil and other resources abroad. It is a colonial project generating a false white supremacist illusion, an enthusiastic oblivion which obscures this reality of exploitation and promises comfort to those that contribute to the order of the system. These people become willing agents of the state, reiterating American patriotic rhetoric or serving as the armed militia which both line the streets to disappear Black and brown communities and storm the Capitol at the president's convenience, who rely upon and defend this colonial project to maintain their state-sanctioned supremacy. For the past 4 years, white liberals, establishment Democrats, corporate elites, and the likes have faced their work and contribution to this project, a creation so unbearable for them to acknowledge that they've shifted all accountability onto a man they so strongly claim to abhor, a man who, for the past 4 years, publicly and shamelessly demonstrated the quintessence of the same system they actively preserve. He was the ugly, temporary nightmare in the white liberal illusion, but he and all that he stood for has been our reality, a reality that we exist in spite of, and which rests solely on our subjugation, a reality that the succeeding administration is all but eager to obscure once more so that its operation will become covert and thus dormant in the eyes of white liberals. They will continue to line their pockets from suffering, benefiting as industries grow from our poverty and exploitation, profiting from fueling wars on our streets and abroad to maintain unlicensed access to endless resources, to extract free labor, and to gain monetarily from industries like the weapons manufacturers, which rely on this turmoil to expand. They are not our friends. Our hope extends far beyond the replacement of a political figure whose function is to manage and expand the colonial project that is the United States. Our hope lies not with maintaining white supremacy for the possibility of incremental change, nor is it with facilitating mobility along a social and economic hierarchy grounded in this supremacy. We strive to both demolish this colonial project, this supremacy, and this hierarchy. We strive to realize a vision that encourages not power over, but power with. A vision in which we collectively contribute to the creation of systems that work for all of us. And until this vision is realized, we can only expect this nightmare to continue and expand. Thank you all so much. Now I'm going to pass it on to Asha E., who is going to read her statement.
Wow, that was so beautiful. Oh my God. I'm just clapping. But yeah, hi, I'm Asha. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm a community organizer in Chi Radical grassroots organizations in Chicago. And I basically wanted to kind of reiterate what she just presented. And you see, these Democrats and these Republicans, they sell us the illusion that the United States is a democracy. At most, it's an oligarchy. the United States kind of maintained itself through prison labor, exploiting the labor of the middle and working class, and requiring a systemic poverty class. They require imperialism, they require neoliberalism. And this is the legacy of an illegal state that is built on the foundations of genocide, slavery, and settler colonialism. And Biden's response to the white supremacists at the Capitol is always add more surveillance, add more police. And the whole time, they're all white supremacists. The White House was built by slaves. So the police, to some extent, agreed with their intent to uphold these American values that, that's why they allowed them entry in the first place. So, with this racist war on terror, that really means more violence against Black, Indigenous, and people of color who resist racism, police violence, imperialism, and capitalism. So Biden already stated that police reform to him looks like funding for more funding for police departments, because he's like, they need more resources to do their job, even though they already receive military grade weapons to use at our community protest or send a National Guard on children. And first of all, the police, they do not need more money. They do not need more training, because their occupation is inherently violent and nothing will change that. Kamala is not our girl boss either. She has a political agenda to uphold the establishment democratic values, which means to return to the status quo that has harmed us, has killed us, and ruined our livelihoods here and abroad. She is a cop, Kamala. That's the only way that I will name her. She does not represent me. So this new administration is a prime example of why we must take direct action. And instead of letting fear guide you or harassing Black and brown organizers to, allow and preach for this sexual harasser, this crime warmonger, and just like this imperialist, you have to be prepared for and know that they will not transform the system. Instead, this is what you can do. You can get on the ground to shake the foundations. You could put cracks in the system. That means getting involved in grassroots organizations, crowdfunding, getting involved in radical mutual aid networks, and donating reparations to Black and brown folks, mainly Black folks. Plus, this distribution of essential resources is really what we need. We need to help our people in housing encampments and just getting to the root causes of we need our essential needs. So that basically means, imagine, how do you want to live? How can you make sure everybody is supported? Because no votes or no administration will guarantee your bodily autonomy or your human rights. Regardless of which racist rapist is in office, we must continue to organize, build power, disrupt, and support the most marginalized people who are oppressed by both of these parties. For example, I am a member of UIC Dissenters in Chicago, and we're organizing, right now we're doing a mutual aid project to assist people in a housing encampment, and we're trying to get them housing. Just like meeting people I don't know, Biden, he never talks about housing everybody. Capitalism produces this housing crisis. So we already know he's not on our side. So our university, we want to get our university to divest from the military industrial complex. We want an end to all war everywhere. We believe war is for profit, not for safety. And we want this money reallocated into life-sustaining resources. So we already know the military and the domestic law enforcement work hand in hand in maintaining all of these systems that just make us die quicker and just ruin our lives. So I'm really excited for this talk, and I'm excited to hear, y'all explaining all of this, because it's kind of intense.
Thank you so much, Asha and Kia, for those opening statements. What a framing for this conversation. I just really deeply appreciate both of your assessments and analyses to ground us today. So I'm going to just transition into introducing our panelists tonight, our guest speakers. First, we have Robin D.G. Kelley, author, scholar, professor, radical, helping us all keep the Black radical tradition alive and well, cultivating Black radical imagination, author of many books, Hammer and Hoe, Freedom Dreams, one of my personal favorites, and also many popular articles. Let's welcome Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for joining us, Robin. Next, we have Noura Erakat. She's a human rights attorney and assistant professor at Rutgers University. She's a legal advocate for Palestinian refugee rights at the UN. She's a researcher, human rights activist, and she has been on CNN, CBS, Fox News, just doing the damn thing. So thank you so much for joining us.
And next we have Ajamu Baraka, national organizer at the Black Alliance for Peace, former 2016 vice presidential candidate with the Green Party, Black internationalist extraordinaire and writer. Welcome, Ajamu. Thank you so much for being here for this important conversation.
And last but definitely not least, we have Adrian Bonifacio. He's the national chairperson of Anak Bayan USA, a grassroots organization of Filipino youth. He works with youth all around the world, fighting for liberation and democracy. So thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome, welcome. I can see folks are already getting excited to hear y'all speak in the chat. So I just want to start us off. Really, the first question is if each of you could speak a little bit about the current political landscape and reality and what you see as what's at stake in this political moment when it comes to U.S. militarism and imperialist projects. And Noura, if you wouldn't mind just kicking us off.
Thank you so much to you all. I have to say, like, I'm sure everybody shares this feeling with me, but listening to you with your just analytical depth, the incision with which you're speaking, the rejection of racial capitalism and a diverse empire makes me, my whole heart is bursting, because I thought I was like a little bit grumpy over here, but obviously you're leading the way and paving the path, and we're following you. So thank you for holding this up and for having the foresight to organize this directly the day afterwards to put this back in focus. I think that the political moment that we're in is a really telling one. We stand at somebody in the course of the lead up to the elections. There was concern over whether or not, right, the debate of we shouldn't be voting just against Trump. We shouldn't just be voting out a neo-fascist. We should be thinking of an alternative. And frankly, the DNC has sabotaged any possibility of a viable alternative. And so I disagreed. I actually thought it was really important for us within the heart of empire, in order to vote out a neo-fascist, in order to stave off a similar ripple effect across the globe, because this neo-fascist movement isn't unique to the United States. We're actually seeing it very clearly, very vividly in Brazil, in India, in Hungary, in Israel, obviously, right, where it's been manifested. And so I thought that it was very important that we actually vote him out for the sake of the rest of the globe, for what the tone that we were setting, but also to establish better conditions for organizing, right? This wasn't about the victory of just voting Trump out. It certainly isn't a victory of voting Biden in, but what are the optimal conditions for organizing that would enable us to fight better and harder without criminalization, without shrinking space, by actually shaming white supremacists and pushing back on what they feel is their right, and feeling emboldened to take up that mantle and space. And so the discussion as it got deeper was then about, but what are the conditions necessary in order to lead us to a new moment where we can actually start to rupture empire? And some who wanted Trump to win thought that if we elected him, that we would actually get closer to that moment. And yet what I saw in the moment of those Capitol riots, that white supremacy insurrection embodied, was actually the rupturing of empire. At its core, it was the cracking, it was the dismantling of an American exceptionalism, that somehow what happens here is a history of an overcoming of racial segregation and apartheid, of settler colonialism, but we remain a white settler colony. And that was affirmed so vividly in that insurrection. And now what I see in the inauguration and in the celebration of identity politics in response to the inauguration yesterday, and I'm not crapping on anybody who is celebrating that, because obviously it was a movement victory also. But I want to emphasize that what we see is now scrambling to put together the edges of tattered empire as it continues to fester here from the inside out. And this is the moment that we're in. This is the moment that I hope that we begin to really rupture identity politics even further so that we can get into the weeds of racial capitalism, as Robin has showed us. As I was just reading an article by Charisse Birdie Stells, who recently wrote a review of the, Isabel Wilkerson's cast, who says for people, they think it's so much easier to change the hearts and minds of people in order to just love one another and tolerate one another. And they don't want to fathom what it would take to dismantle a political economy predicated on the exploitation of racialized, not racial, racialized bodies, their extraction, their dispossession. And it's that fear of being able to imagine that that is possible. We're sitting right now in this temporal time, we're sitting on that possibility and yet not willing to go there. And I'm excited to be a part of the movement that pushes, that opens up that wedge even further, where we crack it open and get deeper into the weeds to seriously talking about defunding the police, defunding the military, and what it means to create communities of care.
Well, I guess maybe I can jump in.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, first, let me just say that I'm really awestruck by the level of analysis, the perspective represented here this evening. It almost appears like we have the framework, we have the analysis, and that what we need to start doing is moving toward how do we more effectively resist? How do we build the kind of revolutionary movement that we have to build in order to advance our interests, in order to transform this nation and to transform the world. But we still, I guess, still have some analysis and some discussion to engage in. This moment is in fact very critical. It's critical because it represents a turning point for the empire. And we have to be very, very mindful of the attempts on the part of the state and the ruling class to manipulate consciousness, to attempt to try to address the legitimation crisis that they face by using our energy, in essence, against ourselves. And what do I mean by that? That basically, the state using the so-called insurrection at the Capitol and the emergence of this traditional right-wing movement represented by the Trump forces, that the state is using that momentum, that reality, that political reality, in a way to, in fact, do the opposite of what we thought might happen with a Biden victory. And that is to, in fact, create the political space that would allow us to be able to organize and to advance our forces. In fact, what we're seeing from the state is a move to constrain and to constrict political analysis, alternative information, to impose on us an ideological conformity that in fact supports and sustains the neoliberal project. So our desire to jettison this more traditional and stereotypical kind of fascist represented by the authoritarianism and cartoonish character of Donald Trump may be setting us up to not recognize even more insidious and perhaps dangerous move being made by the state to usher in a form of neo-fascism that we inadvertently can support or will support by having our attention diverted away from that threat. And what I mean by that is this, that basically when we recognize and remember that neoliberalism is a form of fascism. Neoliberalism, and our dear professor is going to talk about this more in a moment. But neoliberalism came in on the back of a fascist move in Chile. It is a rightist tendency. It is the terroristic coordination of society on behalf of big capital. It is a system that combines and converges capital, big capital, and the state. And as a consequence of that, it is threatened by any kind of upsurge from the people. So what we have to be very careful of is not recognizing that as a consequence of this capitalist crisis, and we have to understand that you can't understand neoliberalism and neo-fascism abstracted from capitalism. There's a consequence of this capitalist crisis that the state is moving to address its legitimation crisis by strengthening the national security state. So this space that we thought we might have, I think is under threat. And therefore we have to be absolutely clear about how we move, absolutely clear about our relationship to the state, our understanding of the state, our understanding of the social and class forces that are supporting the neoliberal Democrats. Because what we can find ourselves inadvertently doing is in fact giving political cover to this move by neoliberal fascism at this critical moment. So, the analysis is something we have to continue to grapple with. We have to talk about the kinds and forms of organizations that we have to begin to build to address this critical moment, because the objective reality is this: the contradictions of this colonial capitalist order will continue to deepen. The redundancy that African people, the African working class and other people of color, the other colonized people in this country face will continue to deepen. The fiscal crisis that this state is facing will result in severe suffering on the parts of millions of people here in this country and globally. So we have to be prepared for this kind of struggle that we have to engage in, and we have to continue these kinds of conversations to talk about the kinds of organized resistance we have to engage in. And we have to remind ourselves too, and I close here with this comment, that the key beyond organization, of course, the key is effectively engaging in the struggle over ideals, to understand that the terrain of consciousness is a contested terrain, and that we've got to understand the challenges of the ideological struggle that we are involved in, because the state understands that, and they are putting into place mechanisms to ensure that the only acceptable views and ideals that will be allowed to be disseminated are those ideals that uphold the capitalist state and the settler colonial project.
Because I'll jump in, is that okay? I just wanted to follow Ajamu. First of all, it's amazing to be in this space with all of you. Like Noura and Ajamu said at the beginning, the analysis you present is great. I was deleting half the stuff I planned to say because you already said it, which is great. And in fact, I could delete half of what I want to say about neoliberalism because Ajamu already said it brilliantly. In fact, just a reminder, Bertram Gross wrote this book in 1980 called Friendly Fascism, which was about that moment. Even he began writing it before Reagan came to power, but it was about that moment and what it means. And I'll say a little bit about that in a second. But I can't agree more with the presentations and analysis that's been laid out. I would just throw in a couple other things. I think we're all here because we know that Biden-Harris, though may be a break with particular aspects of the neo-fascist order that Trumpism brought, it's definitely not a break with US militarism, US imperialism. And it's not even like they're trying to hide it. I mean, the slogan, America is back, it isn't about, the rise of the working class. It's about America on the world stage, trying to do its work while it is a dying empire. But empires don't die on their own. I mean, they could be resuscitated. And so it's up to us in terms of the work we're doing organizing to fight back. There's some signs that we just all sort of know and need to pay attention to. Tony Blinken's going to be the Secretary of State. First thing he says that I don't recognize the regime of Nicolas Maduro. I recognize Juan Guaido. I mean, that's a continuation of Obama. It's a continuation of Trump. It's a continuation of US militarism and imperial power. We're going to witness an escalation of wars, not just the continuation of US policy in Palestine, where that's just straight up genocide that we have seen, and it can't be all laid at Trump's feet. We're going to see escalation of wars with Russia and China as the US is going to increase arms sales, but the difference is they may be a little bit hands-offish toward the Saudis, for example, but they're going to sell as many arms as Trump. They're just not going to make an announcement of it. They're just going to do that work. Yes, the Biden-Harris folks have rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, called for a moratorium on Arctic drilling, and stopping the Keystone XL. This is all great. This is all, I would argue, not just their goodwill and good graces, but a victory of struggle. However, the military will still be used to fight the climate catastrophe-driven wars all over the world. AFRICOM is not going to be dismantled anytime soon. And so we're going to see all that, and that's why you're here. You're here because you're prepared to fight. You're here because you're prepared to put at the forefront a struggle against the continuation of US imperialist policies. And there's lots I could say, but let me just close very quickly. I mean, you all know about Avril Haines. You all know about the identity politics that Noura so brilliantly laid out. Is the identity politics that would allow for someone like General Lloyd Austin, first Black Secretary of State, hooray. The cat who is all in bed with the defense industry and who, once again, is, and not that it matters, civilian or military, the Secretary of Defense wages war. But this is someone who's very problematic and very dangerous. Avril Haines, problematic, dangerous, for reasons we could talk about. But just closing, I just want to remind us of one other thing. I'm not the first one to say this, but it's something that's been on my mind. We have to do a better job of fighting on behalf of the prisoners of war in the United States. Black Agenda Report had a really great piece by Glenn Ford about this, but it's something that a lot of us have been doing. We've got people like Mumia Sundiata Kohli, Jamil Amin, Leonard Peltier, you got Veronza Bowers, Ed Poindexter, Jalil Muntakim, and Dr. Mutulu Shakur, both were in prison, both had COVID. Mutulu, not only contracted COVID, but he can't even get compassionate release. This is a man who's suffering from bone marrow cancer. We need to know about that because remember, when they went to court, they were making the argument that they were prisoners of war. And so therefore should have the support of international law in the United Nations, and that was denied. And part of the reason why that judges hate them is because they made that argument. So we've got to really deal with that because, I mean, reality winner, prisoner of war. I mean, there's a lot that we need to do right here that goes beyond just looking abroad in terms of foreign policies. I'll stop there. I could go on.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who's spoken so far. This is a really inspiring space to be in conversation with you all. I've been really excited, but then even with all the people who are in the chat, I think this is a really great space to be able to share analysis, sharpen our analysis, and then figure out how we're going to fight together. You know, I resonate so much with a lot of the things that the previous panelists have already talked about. You know, America as a dying empire, right? That's an image that might seem hard for people to believe, but we know it to be true because capitalism, imperialism, it's self-destructive, right? But we also know that a dying empire, America as a dying empire, it's not going to go down without a fight, right? And so that's where these things about you know, engaging in a struggle of ideas. The ruling class here in the U.S., the figureheads of imperialism, know that that's a battleground that's going to be hotly contested over the next 4 years and beyond. And that constraining and constricting, I really like those words, is exactly what we have to break free from. And so what this current political moment is asking us to do is to be critical, to see the whole picture beyond what we are currently being conditioned to. So it's not a question of, you know, I was so irritated by the whole Biden saving the heart and soul of America throughout that campaign trail. It was never a question about that. In reality, it's really about how do we treat Biden as the new face of US imperialism, as the one at its helm now. For us in Anak Bayan, we're a national liberation organization for the Philippines. We only have to look to our homeland to know why Biden is one of the biggest enemies now of the Filipino people, right? The crisis in a neo-colony, so you know, a country that isn't necessarily colonized in name, but we know it to be true politically, militarily, economically, to be colonized by countries, especially the US, is in a constant state of crisis because of US policies that have spanned from Republican to Democrat time and time again. You know, currently there is a crushing poverty rate. Unemployment and underemployment is around a fifth of the entire population. There's huge losses in agricultural workers, and the Philippines, if you've seen pictures or know anything about it, is a huge agricultural country. There's a political crisis. The Philippines has its own fascist still in power, Rodrigo Duterte, who has passed his own counter-terror laws being used against all critics. There's massive counterinsurgency efforts, massacres of indigenous people, massacres of peasants, mass arrests of human rights defenders, desecration of bodies, and of course, continued arms deals with the US. And this is even affecting activists who are fighting for liberation movements in the Philippines but are based here. You know, those counterinsurgency tactics, the jailing of political prisoners here, those are all things that have been historically in the toolkit of Democratic and Republican presidencies and administrations to try to crush the strength and the power of international solidarity, a very potent tool against imperialism, right? And so by putting the reality of people in the Philippines, of people in Palestine, of people in Puerto Rico at the forefront, we realize what is at stake at this political moment. And you know, that's not to mention, of course, the millions here who are suffering under imperialism and the repression of the state. But if we put those lives at the forefront, we realize that if we don't cut through the lies, if we aren't able to engage in this ideological struggle, this battle to break free from whatever constraints ideologies like imperialism are putting on us, then it's hundreds of millions of lives at stake, right? It's our liberation at stake. And so that's the battle that we have now and that we need to fight stronger than before, despite Trump being out.
Thank you all so much for such insightful and profound thoughts and ideas that really help us to have an overview of what this discussion will go in more depth with. So my next question is for Robin. And you touched on it a lot, but we really wanted to kind of take it back, scale it back a little bit. And if you could provide a working definition or explanation of neoliberalism, just to ground the conversation, It's definitely a jargon term that is thrown around a lot, and there are some people who may be familiar with it, but don't necessarily know the knit and the grit of it. So yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you. Well, Ajamu basically laid out some really critical elements of it. I'll just give you just a basic definition. So it's the idea that markets, free trade, no regulations, the privatization of everything, of every sphere of social and economic life is the best way to structure society. And it is not, neoliberalism, it's a particular variant of racial capitalism. It's not something that's different. It is very much, in some ways, it became hegemonic in response to the global slump of the 1970s. And again, it's not limited to Western Hemisphere, it's global. It's not limited to any allegiance to a party. It's not Democratic or Republican. Neoliberal policies have been consistently pushed since the 1970s in the US. Every single regime in the US has promoted neoliberal policies. It's the common sense. Neoliberalism, basically, like capitalism has always done, maximizes profits by driving down labor costs. And they do this through outsourcing, through exploiting unprotected foreign labor, weakening, waging war on trade unions, imposing free trade policies in tandem with austerity. It's eroded or eliminated really the social wage by dismantling the welfare state in the Keynesian era, eroding government protections for the most vulnerable people. It's revolutionized money, monetary, fiscal, taxes, cutting taxes, which of course social wage, and financial policies as a means of promoting unregulated free market activity. And this is another element of the fascist component of neoliberalism. It has continually assaulted all democratic institutions everywhere. The US is not an exception. I mean, if you want a great study of neoliberalism, look at New York in the 1970s and you'll see, look at Michigan in the last 20 years. And you'll see disfranchisement, the assault on political institution, the assault on voting rights, the assault on collective bargaining, all forms of popular power, all what? In the name of individual liberty. So anyway, just one last thing about neoliberalism. The myth of privatization of everything is like neoliberals are against the state. And that's not true. They're all for the state. They're just they're against regulation, against the social safety net, against protections for vulnerable people. But they want the state to make public lands and resources available for private ownership and investment. They want the state to make transportation and communications infrastructure with public funds for capital. They want the state to create a strong national security apparatus, covert wars, overt wars, interventions to protect markets, domestic policing and surveillance, prisons, militarized border. And part of the magic of neoliberalism is using public funds to pay for privatized services within the military state. And lastly, they like the state to bail out private industry. So it's public risk for privatization. And so they'll bail out in a second. I mean, if you look at the CARES Act, what did they do? They bailed out oil and gas industry. I mean, they gave some $3 to $7 billion to 10% of the 7,000 companies, and it allows companies basically let workers go while CEOs for Exxon and Chevron got bonuses. And that's just like the tip of the iceberg. I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I'm sick.
Thank you so much for that definition and breakdown. This next question I want to ask to Noura, and it's really, can you help ground us in the kind of why of US militarism, right? So much of what's been laid out, right? The terrible, violent, and racist wars that the US wages, the treatment of Black communities within the US, the incarceration of huge numbers of people, including political prisoners. We know the horrific things that the US state does, but it would be great if you could kind of just break down for us, what is the role of militarism in upholding US capitalism and empire?
I'd be happy to answer that. I just want to start off by saying, bless you, Robin, for soldiering through great illness. Just, you know, there's a lot of personal sacrifice in this work, and I see you do that consistently. So thank you. I also just want to add a couple of things in addition to the emphasis that Robin made on the state and neoliberalism. Neoliberals don't want, you know, this idea that they want to starve the state, right? Isn't necessarily true, because they do need the state to protect their takings, to protect their dispossessions, as well as to regulate as they see fit. The other thing I want to emphasize, again, as Robin said, that it's global, but not only is it global, but it coexists with national liberation struggles. Just because you are part of a national liberation struggle does not mean that you are also committed to a project to dismantling neoliberalism. And we see that very clearly in Palestine and across the former colonies of the Middle East, right? Where there isn't necessarily an avowed rejection of that project, but in fact, and we can discuss this because it's obviously different political economies in each of those entities, but to say that, again, this isn't particular to the West, and it isn't particular to former colonial powers. The other thing I want to emphasize on neoliberalism as well is something that Wendy Brown has highlighted recently, which is that neoliberalism isn't just about the economy and the relationship to the state, but is also about us, is about what we normalize in our regulation in the social and what we consider social and not, right? It goes to the heart of, you know, this conflict of whether or not the social is a real entity, right? Are Black people a people? Are immigrants are we part of a society? Or in fact, are we just a motley crew of individuals that happen to come together, thereby, you know, casting any kind of government service like welfare, like housing, like health, like anti-racism, right, as overreach rather than corrective, right, and necessary. And so neoliberalism isn't just about the state, but is also about who we are in that state and how we move within it. So then to the question that was posed to me, what is militarism and the relationship to capitalism? So the very obvious thing, and I think should occur to everybody, especially in this group, is that obviously there is a relationship between U.S. endless imperial warfare and, you know, U.S. weapons manufacturers. So that goes without saying that there is profit to be made in war, not just profit to be made by selling, right? But in advertising and the different parts and the transportation of these weapons and the distribution of the excess military weapons, as we see in the 1033 program and the militarization of local police. I mean, these are industries, right? That we can break down, just as Timothy Mitchell has meticulously broken down how the extraction of oil from the Middle East is a political economy that far extends just the sale and trade of oil. Right? So that goes without saying, but I want to add three other things about what is the relationship between militarism and capitalism. One is, going back to this, what we were discussing earlier, it sustains the idea of American exceptionalism by situating the United States as the global moral police. Right? Our distribution of weapons and our militarism abroad is framed as a global good. Professor John Yoo of UC Berkeley said as much in defense of the Bush administration, which started the US's formal war on terror, when he said there is no such thing as international law of self-defense because the US is the global police and can do what it needs, right? But at the crux of that is the mythology that the US is exceptional to the rest of the colonial, racist, human rights violating world. And that's especially important for suppressing protest within this colony. The second is about the maintenance of the control, or the third, I should say, is about the maintenance of control of geopolitical spaces, even when there is no extraction being done. So this isn't just about militarism, as we've seen in Iraq, based on a lie. I read today a horrible quote, and I forget, a congressman from Colorado, who basically said, I didn't fight in Iraq for our freedom to come and watch the green zone be created in the Washington, D.C. Capitol, right? Completely believing Bush's lies, creating some false distinction between him, his lies and Trump's lies. But more than that, it's obfuscating what we already know, which was that the war in Iraq was about the extraction of resources, was about of those natural resources and the maintenance of access to them. So that's the point. Even when there are no resources to be extracted, there is much to be gained by controlling who has access to those resources, right? So that no other power can compete with the United States. For example, China can't develop that relationship with Iraq. Other relationships can't develop in the Persian Gulf, but also about maintaining these spaces as places to police the rest of the world, as we've seen with the maintenance of the occupation in Hawaii, which often gets forgotten as well, even though the fact is that our largest military base is in Hawaii, and we maintain that as a settler colonial space because it actually overlooks 30% of the world's population, and yet there isn't necessarily extraction there. That's third. And then the final one, what is the relationship between capitalism and militarism, is the feedback loop between the colony and the metropole. The US tactics of domination that are used abroad are recycled here in the United States. And then as they're experiments. These are colonial experiments, right? There's so many people debate, well, what came first, the Nazi regime or US Jim Crow, what I would term apartheid. It would be termed apartheid if the convention was legislated only 6 years before, it would have been termed apartheid. And so it's this feedback loop. And that feedback loop is also used to maintain dominance within the metropole, which is also a colony. And so I don't think these things can be bifurcated, right? This idea of, if you want to carry guns, go over there. Or I fought that war over there to prevent it from here. But these are actually one and the same. So that was so brilliantly mentioned earlier, the demonization of Arabs and Muslims at home certainly sustains and enables people to apologize for endless wars in the Middle East abroad, but also know that these wars against Muslims and Arabs and other people of color, BIPOC communities here, are also sustaining that white settler colony again. The indigenous takings of land have not ceased. The exploitation of Black communities has not ceased. And so I think that these are also connected. And so the bifurcation isn't just about money, but ultimately about control and hegemony.
Thank you so much for that insight. Truly shook me, and it's something that I'll hold. So the next question, we should ground this conversation in the historical memory of our new President Biden's record in the Obama administration. Of course, we had to bring him up as someone who fueled massive deportations, oversaw violent repression at Standing Rock and of the BLM movement, as well as drone wars in Yemen and Pakistan. What does US imperialism and militarism look like in the context of neoliberalism and under traditionally democratic politicians? So why don't we start with Adrian, and then maybe everyone else can chime in.
Yeah, thanks for that. I wanted to paint a picture for this question. What does imperialism, militarism look like under the Democrats, with going over just a brief snapshot of how it's played out in the Philippines. But no, this story could be repeated or adapted to so many other countries around the world. The Democrats have had a long history of just ravaging the Philippines in terms of its militarist and neoliberal policies. The Philippines was granted quote unquote independence in 1946 under a Democratic presidency, Truman. But immediately after that independence was granted, there were different military agreements that were set up, a basing agreement and a mutual defense treaty, which basically secured bases in the country, all over the country, that would be the launching pad for further ways to continue influencing the country. And of course, that led to a lot of protests against the people, decades and decades of protests, until in the early 90s, the Filipino people waged such a long struggle that the government, the Philippine Senate, was forced to take a vote and end the basing contracts with the US. It was a huge historic vote just because the Philippines is one of the largest military bases basing countries of the US in the Asia Pacific region. So that was 1991. A few years later, under Clinton, the US found another way in to circumvent the ban of bases in the Philippines through what's called a visiting forces agreement. And visiting forces or rotational presence is a type of military agreement that exists in many other countries across the world. The name is misleading, the visiting forces agreement, because you would think that it would mean that the US is just visiting, right? They come in, they come out, and then there's no permanent base. What actually happens in a visiting forces agreement is that troops are deployed, and before those troops leave, a new set of troops are visiting. So it's perpetual deployment. It's permanent deployment and de facto basing, despite the ban on bases. If we're talking about Biden, under the Obama-Biden administration, they pushed for a particular form of and an even worse form of this visiting forces agreement, what's called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. And under that, the US was able to set up camp on any agreed location. That's the literal phrasing in the agreement, any agreed location, with no restriction on the number of troops that can come in, no restriction on the length of stay. The US gets to control who comes in and out of these agreed locations, and all of this is rent-free. And not only that, because we're talking about what it looks like under neoliberalism, is that these same provisions are extended to private defense contractors as well in the Philippines. And the US gets to dictate who those are. We, of course, also know about the US pivot to Asia, which was a term popularized by none other than everyone's favorite girl boss, Hillary Clinton. It was a foreign policy move to set the country's eye on the Asia Pacific region politically, militarily, economically, particularly to combat China's growing strength in the region. And so why am I bringing all of this up? It's to paint a picture that the Democratic Party has been continuing the militarist tradition of US imperialism in countries like the Philippines. And that leads to very, very harmful effects for the people there. The de facto basing lays the groundwork for brutal attacks on women, on trans folks. Many people might be familiar with the killing of trans woman Jennifer Laude in the Philippines in 2014 by US Marine. It also leads to huge environmental destruction, pollution. It leads to counterterrorism efforts to expand the US's counterterror efforts in many other parts of the world. And of course, it allows the US to continue using the Philippines as a launching pad for militarism in the Asia Pacific. And aside from what militarism looks like, how does that pair with neoliberalism and neoliberal attacks? The one case I'd want to highlight here is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which, if we remember back under the Obama-Biden administration, there were huge protests around the world against this TPPA, particularly because it spelled disaster for labor rights, for environmental rights, for things like national sovereignty. Some of the provisions in the TPPA make companies on the same level as people, or in the same level as states in terms of negotiating certain trade disputes, right? Obama was pushing for the US's participation in this. Trump backed out, but there's a chance that Biden might come back in. And there was a chat, there was a question in the chat earlier about how does imperialism extract from other countries to keep it afloat? Free trade agreements like this are one of the favorite tools of neoliberal Democrats, neoliberal politicians in general. I'm thinking the North American Free Trade Agreement under Clinton and many others, to maintain backward or underdeveloped economies in countries like the Philippines so that they can access raw materials, cheap labor, and even a market to dump extra goods, right? To keep gaining those super profits in the face of crisis. So, this is something to watch out for if Biden and the establishment will now push for further free trade agreements like the TPP. There's a similar renewal of the new version of NAFTA just last year. And this will really lead to, again, disastrous effects. In the Philippines, rice farmers are going hungry. There are many stories of parents who for dinner, they just drink wine, rice wine at night so that they can have other food to feed their families. There are call center workers in the Philippines who are employed or contracted by major companies based here in the US who aren't allowed to evacuate their buildings even when there are earthquakes, literal earthquakes happening, because they have quotas to fill. And so these are, the effects of neoliberal and militarist policies in countries like the Philippines, but I'm sure that many other speakers and even the attendees on this call can speak to how this is affecting people around the world and even in the US.
Thank you so much for that Adrian. I now want to ask a question to you, Ajamu, and this is pivoting just a little bit. If you could talk a little bit about how you see the connection between wars waged on Black communities within the US via policing is one way, but the wars that get waged on Black communities within the US to, wars that the US wages abroad. Just what is the connection there? How are we understanding the function of these two things in relation to one another?
Thank you. I think that what we've been talking about this evening are those connections. And what we're talking about is the structural manifestation, the political expression of the white supremacist, colonial, capitalist patriarchy that developed once Europe spilled out of its boundaries in 1492 and invaded the Americas, creating the material basis for its eventual global hegemony. What we are seeing today, as Joe Biden talks about the need for unity and reestablishing relationships between the US and Europe, is his attempt to rehabilitate or revive, if you will, some of the relationships that were not severed, but under pressure as the Trump forces advanced their America First project that exposed the tensions and contradictions between the US-based capitalists and the global, the transnational finance and corporate capital. That project that Joe Biden is attempting to revive is a project of white supremacy. It is a project that says that the only way that the pan-European project will survive is if we find a way to work together again, to re-embrace the concept that Kwame Nkrumah talked about, collective imperialism under the leadership of the US. That's why they say that Joe Biden is a transatlanticist. But we have to unpack that and expose it. We have to see, we have to identify for what it is. It is a white supremacist project. And that's why this notion of white supremacy is so fundamentally important. And I'm not talking about the cartoonish understanding of white supremacy that, the clownish activities of some of these militias, as dangerous as they might be, that correspond to our sort of simplistic understanding of what a racist is supposed to be. I'm talking about the more sophisticated white supremacy, the white supremacist ideology that sees Europe as the apex of civilization, that sees European culture as the most developed culture of the globe, and that sees something that we refer to as modernization, as the inevitable ending point of all people, and that all nations and all people should strive to mimic and try to be like Europe. Okay, those notions of white supremacy, that white supremacist ideology is something that is not reducible to race or ethnicity, gender, or anything else. Okay, that's why we say that Barack Obama is a white supremacist. That's why we say that the Democratic Party is a white supremacist party. So the attempt by Joe Biden is to rehabilitate that project, And at the center of that project, this is what we have to remind ourselves. The center of this white supremacist colonial capitalist project, the mechanism by which it enforces itself and maintains its hegemony is state violence. The embracing of this white supremacist structure called NATO, the enhancement of the US ability to wage war with these obscene military budgets, the creation of the Department of Defense 1033 program domestically, that is the program responsible for militarizing police forces across this country, the Israeli training of police forces. All of these are the structural expressions of this commitment to maintaining white supremacy through force. We've got to understand that and recognize that. Understand that war is being waged against us in this country and globally, not just against African people, but against all colonized people. When we understand the terms of struggle, and then the strategies become more clear. So we in the Black Alliance of Peace, we try to be clear. You know, we say basically, you know, when we came together and launched this thing in 2017, we understood the trajectory of US politics. We understood that the crisis of legitimacy was only going to continue to deepen. And we knew that as a consequence of that, the state would be more dependent on the use of force and violence. And we had to prepare our people for that. So this move by Joe Biden is a move to reestablish white supremacy, but in a more acceptable form. We've got to unpack it. We've had to expose it. Look, both parties are committed to the idea of full spectrum dominance. At the center of full spectrum dominance is militarism, okay? So the war being waged against African people and colonized people in this country, in the US domestically, is part of the global process of attempting to try to maintain a global white supremacist imperialism. And that is the connection that we have to continually make. Most people don't even know, for example, how the US has divided up the entire planet into these global command structures, the arrogance of these people. And one of the main command structures that we've been attempting to highlight in the Black Alliance of Peace's work is the US Africa Command, a command that was created October 1st, 2008, right before the ascendancy of your first Black president, and expanded under that person 2,400%. The footprint on the African continent is massive. 53 out of the 54 states on the African continent have military relations, in military to military relation with the US. The US is training police forces across the African continent. And these are some of the same kinds of comprador and neoliberal puppets that are fronting for white power on the continent that we have in the US. The same kind of neoliberal comprador puppets fronting for white power across the country in all of these Democrat-controlled cities, okay? So we make those connections politically, and we make those connections in terms of the role of the state. So these are the things we have to make, and we have to articulate these things in clear, unambiguous language. And that's why I'm so happy about this conversation tonight, because folks are laying it out in clear terms. And this is exactly what we have to do. We look, time out for any kind of vagueness. You know, our people can will understand what we're up against. They'll understand what capitalism is. They will understand what is imperialism. They'll understand what is colonialism. But we've got to be prepared with the language and the vocabulary and the skills to engage our folks, okay? But that is the historic responsibility right now, folks. You know, if we're not talking about building a revolutionary response, a revolutionary movement here in this country, that basically we just propping up, upholding white supremacy. That's the connection.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you so much for your insight, for framing and unpacking and clarifying, as you were saying, a lot of ideas that are integral to understanding, you know, when it comes to our resistance. So right now we're going to move into the Q&A section of this panel discussion. And whoever of you feels comfortable, you know, discussing any of the questions. And also the rest of you can continue to add to the chat, and we can come around to the questions if we have time towards the end. But the first question that I wanted to pose from the chat is, what do you believe are the best ways to educate the general US population on US imperialism? And then it says, in my experience, it seems most Americans are very ignorant of the violence the US has exported and continues to export abroad, and become very uncomfortable at any acknowledgement of that. So any of y'all can jump in.
I'm sure people have better answers than me, but you know, rather than sort of give a litany of things we can do, I just want to point to successful moments in history when, in fact, anti-imperialism may not have been hegemonic in terms of everyone, but certainly has been like been more robust. So if you think about even the 1960s, Global 68, where in the name of anti-war, a critique of a US liberal regime. Remember, this, you know, this is the Johnson administration, the one that people are propping up. This is a regime that the movements of the day stood up against around its military policies, around the US, you know, occupation, its role in Indonesia, its role in the Philippines, its role in the Dominican Republic, its role in the coup in Brazil. I mean, people really knew something about it. And to the point where, you know, athletes in Mexico City from all over the world were making stance against imperialism. So there are times when that could be built. The other period is in the 1980s, where before Occupy, the largest demonstration in the US at that point in the 80s was an anti-nuclear, anti-war demonstration. Then, of course, the anti-war demonstration around Iraq. So there are moments of upsurge when it's not, you know, again, it doesn't have to be the majority of the people, but there's a way in which there's this kind of erasure. And so, in fact, I think the other Asha might have said this about, you know, the erasing of memory, you know, a kind of, and so what we are fighting constantly is that erasure of a kind of collective memory. But we actually have a history of anti-imperialism in this country that we need to build. And the work that all of you are doing is part of that.
I couldn't agree more. I think what happens when we think about imperialism is because it's again, even though we've affirmed multiple times that imperialism is actually happening here. Imperialism is not just beyond the border, right? But it's actually here within these borders. The continued settler decolonization, the continued native erasure of native communities, the continuing expansion of different pipelines, and the massacre of memories, the not holding to account any American or settler for any native genocide. Leonard Peltier's continued imprisonment is all part of this imperialist project here within the borders and not just outside of them. And so something that I've learned in my study of historic articulations of Black Palestinian solidarity and have developed this analysis together with Robin in struggle and in thought has been that Black Palestinian solidarity was never in fact defined as such. It was basically the Black internationalist tradition that was in solidarity with different anti-colonial movements, including the Palestinian struggle for freedom. right?
Exactly.
And at the heart of that isn't about Black Palestine. The heart of that is about anti-imperialism. And so when, folks ask, it becomes so hard. Well, what does it mean to be an anti-imperialist? Well, you know what that means? It means I'm going to protest pipelines. I'm going to protest with Native folks. It means I want to defund the police. It means that when I see white supremacist insurrectionists, take over the Capitol, I don't want to include white terrorists under the DHS's mandate. That would be expanding police authority when I want to reduce police authority. It means supporting boycott, divestment, and sanctions unequivocally, because we are not in solidarity with the repression and the settler colonization and native erasure of Palestinians over there. We are part and parcel of that. We are our tax dollars, our memories, our propaganda, our media violence about Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims is all a part of that. And so BDS has to be a cornerstone of that struggle. I mean, and you can do that by resisting, right? The Title VI definition that Trump expanded, which Biden is not likely to rescind, which adopts the IRA definition that frames anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism on student campuses. It means actually fighting against police exchanges between the United States and Israel, as Durham successfully has done. I mean, the way that we can resist anti-imperialism always begins at home. Always begins at home because it's part of it. And we just passed the 19th year anniversary of Guantanamo Bay. In addition to, the colonial occupation of Cuban land and jurisdiction, it's also something that we've never been held account to. Obama should have been held to account for pardoning the Bush administration for enacting torture, right? So I think all of these things that we think about when we think about anti-imperialism as just restraining the US from over there is actually about what we do here in our communities, and is much more tangible than we're led to believe.
Thank you. Were you gonna add to that? I'm gonna throw another question that we got from our audience. Someone wrote, how and to what extent are the political structures and mechanisms of government on this land actually dependent on imperialist domination and extraction globally? Where could we learn more about this relationship? And the second part of the question is, does dismantling of US empire mean dismantling of the US? And where could we learn about this further? So if one of the panelists wants to maybe just clarify and respond to that question.
I would jump in real quick and say that basically not only the relationship between the US and the world resulted in, or the relationship between the US, the settler colonial state, and the expansion of its power across the territory that came to be known as the US, provided the material basis for what we see as the US state. That relationship was then enhanced as the US state expanded beyond the borders of its conquered territories and was in competition with the other European empires globally. And that competition, of course, ended up being centered on places like, for example, Africa. That led to the Berlin Conference, where they tried to mediate and mitigate the tensions between them. It eventually led to the first imperialist war, and then eventually the second imperialist war. So violence is at the center of this project. Super exploitation is at the center of it. And that's why this conversation is so incredibly important, because people are laying out and making the connections between the material basis of US policies. That is not just about some bad people in Congress that maybe we can change their minds, but it's about an understanding that these folks have objective interests and that they are attempting to make policy to advance their interests. Biden wants to maintain the hegemony of U.S. capital. He wants to be able to make U.S. capital more effective. He wants to reposition U.S. capitalists to be able to more effectively exploit the land, resources, and labor of people globally. The creation of the West is as a consequence of colonial exploitation. So yes, those connections we make. And when we began to shift power from this rapacious class, this greedy, rapacious class, the rapacious greed of these freaks, it will end up being the dismantlement of the US colonial state and in fact, the West. You can't have it both ways. There's no way that we're going to be able to, we're not going to reform this, especially when we talk about it, understand this basis, that basically we're not prepared for authentic decolonization, which means completely revamping this state, taking power away from these corporate capitalists and bringing that power to the people, then you're not really prepared for liberation, because that's the only way that we're able to free ourselves and in fact, free the world.
Absolutely, thank you so much. The next question in the chat was, how can a Black person be a white supremacist? So maybe we can dive into that a little bit more.
Well, since I said it, I will say very briefly that if one is committed to upholding white power, then one can conclude that one is a white supremacist in a sense. That if you believe in the dominance of white culture, European culture, if you you support the dominance of the white capitalist class, then you are in fact a white supremacist. You are upholding white power. So, you know, it doesn't matter what your race or your ethnicity. It's almost like another part of a question like that would be, can a person who's identified as a non-male be a patriarch and embrace patriarchy? Of course you can, okay? So white supremacist ideology and culture cannot be reducible to one's race, ethnicity, gender, or whatever, nationality, okay? So these folks that we see in the Biden administration, General Alston, Susan Rice, Kamala Harris, all these people, from my point of view, are in fact white supremacists. And we've got to understand that they are in alignment with the enemy and treat them accordingly.
Thank you for that.
If I can add to that,
absolutely.
Not directly, but you know, because I've been grappling with this question. I'm actually, look, I'm such a nerd. I'm gonna just expose my nerdiness. I'm revisiting the 1975 drafting of UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism as a form of racism and racist domination. And so going back and reading, you know, the text from 1976, where there was uproar over this. And what I'm finding, because I wanted to know, was the commitment to anti-racism among Palestinians one that was rooted, that also was cognizant of anti-Blackness or not? And what I'm, finding very clearly is that how we define racism, right, and how we've come to define racism in the United States, not even, so there's a non-critical approach which identifies anti-racism as colorblindness in the United States, especially since the 1976 Supreme Court decision on Baki. But there's another way of defining it as just wanting equality and inclusion and political enfranchisement. And what's missing from this analysis is that racism and racial hierarchy is an international project, as Ajamu has pointed out for us, right? That this is about colonialism. The world that we live in is a colonial reality, and one that, you know, demonstrates the success of it with ruptures and places of hope. And I'm not the historian as Professor Kelley is here, but just to dive in, that this wasn't an accident. In the aftermath of the First World War, as the League of Nations established itself to both mitigate tensions between imperial powers who are now scrambling for control of vanquished German and Ottoman territories, right? There's also a movement for self-determination. And in order to both quell that struggle, as well as to placate Native uprising and Native calls for freedom, the League of Nations established the mandate system, which proposed that nations could enjoy national independence on condition that they mirror European government and society. So it is no mistake that this idea that, you know, as Ajamu equates white supremacy with the mirroring of Europe, that's an actual project. And despite Third World Revolt, despite, you know, successful revolutions, they've more or less been successful in establishing that hegemony, which brings us back to think about, well, then is white supremacy basically European Eurocentrism that has been obfuscated, where we just believe that this is the natural order of things, right? Or are there other ways to govern ourselves? Are there other ways of having relations? Is the nuclear family, in fact, the only way of family that we can imagine? Or just think about that in all levels, right? Even racial hierarchies that we aim to destroy are also derivatives of this Eurocentrism.
Right.
Go
ahead.
Well, just real quick, a concrete example of how white supremacy is normalized. The very fact that people in the U.S. can support the notion that the U.S. state has a right and a responsibility to determine the leadership of other nations like Venezuela is, to me, a concrete manifestation of that ideology. You know, the same argument that they made concerned about Russian interference and all of that, you know, they don't understand that basically, you know, there's a connection between that and their so-called concern about and their attempt to assert themselves on nations like Venezuela. And the logic that one can use that they asserted around Donald Trump could have been used again when Donald Trump contested the election. And if another country like the Russians or whoever decided that they were going to recognize Donald Trump as the legitimate president, then the rationale was consistent. It's the same thing that they have done in Venezuela and other places. But the fact that these things are not connected and that people don't seem to even recognize it, to me, is a concrete manifestation of the assumptions of white privilege and white supremacy.
Can I just jump in on this? Because I think it's a really important conversation. I agree with everything that's been said. This is why having the right analysis is really important. If we continue to think of the United States as a flawed democracy, then we will not have the right analysis. This is an anti-democracy built on settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is based on white supremacy. And that's why any kind of dismantling of a system requires thinking about, say, the land question in terms of indigenous sovereignty, for example. You know, to think, like, what does it mean that the Diné people are denied, you know, their full sovereign rights and forced to work in a weapons industry making bombs in New Mexico? I mean, that's a really interesting, complicated, terrible situation that says that we need to think about indigenous sovereignty. We need to think about the way that reproductive rights, for example, you know, especially when it comes to women of color, is part of the kind of fascist war on women's bodies. The Irwin detention facility is part of the expansion of the fascist state. And what happened there? immigration policy. Again, think of the US as a settler colonial state and think about policies that go way beyond trying to fix our anti-democracy. But issues like open borders, these are not pipe dreams. I mean, open borders everywhere. And finally, and I'm going to get in trouble for this, I know it's kind of controversial, but just as there are Black and Brown and Native people in the structure, in the apparatus of the white supremacist settler colonial state who do its bidding, I would argue that there are also white people who are anti-white supremacists who are doing certain work. And I think that one of the mistakes that we made is assuming, not us, but assuming that those people who showed up at the Capitol insurrection were the white working class. They were not the white working class. They were the middle strata. They were police, firemen, military, veterans. They were elected officials, and they were professional racists, like that Negro Enrique Tarrio, head of the Proud Boys. And in terms of white supremacy, yes, there are people who do the bidding of the state. And then there are those who showed up with the MAGA hats. I don't know, CNN and MSNBC didn't want to comment on all those Black people who were there involved in the storming of the Capitol. And we just have to come to terms with that. And they're not the ones in power. And yet those people who staged it, actually, they don't represent the vast majority of white people who are dealing with COVID, dealing with student loans, dealing with unemployment, and they're real. And I have to give props to organizations like Standing Up for Racial Justice, Surge in Georgia, when all these people were registering voters. Surge was in white counties registering white voters for Democrats, and dealing with the kind of blowback they would get, and groups like Southern Crossroads. So there are people, and they're not just allies. They have to be kind of revolutionaries as well. John was absolutely right. You got to have a revolution, and that revolution has to be class struggle. Sorry, it's old-fashioned, but it's real, and we cannot just dismiss everybody as, like, every white person on the planet as somehow a sort of perfect expression of those people who, as my friend Charisse calls it, engaged in the Cracker Rebellion. I see you, Charisse. But it's real, so we got to think about, like, how do we build class struggle in a way that centers indigenous sovereignty, that centers, reproductive rights, people of color, dismantling racism, racial capitalism, and all that stuff.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to ask 3 questions. Feel free to tackle all of them, or one if one sticks out to you. So the first one is, what are your thoughts on how a lot of people, particularly moderate liberals, tend to romanticize or stan politicians? We're starting to see that with Kamala Harris and the whole girl boss thing. Then this person says, I do believe representation is important in positions of power, though I think it's dangerous when it comes to putting politicians on pedestals, given the lack of accountability that comes with it. The next question is, what does a Biden presidency mean for the question of Palestine? Then the third question is, are the material conditions of neoliberal, multiracial, white supremacist imperialism, a la Biden, Harris, any better than the neo-fascist flavor of organizing for liberation or revolution? And if you need me to repeat that last question, I gladly will. But if any of y'all want to tackle any of those questions, or all of them.
Can you repeat the last question?
Got it. No problem. Okay. So, are the material conditions of neoliberal, multiracial, white supremacist imperialism, so like Biden or Harris, any better than the neo-fascist flavor of organizing for liberation and revolution?
I'm gonna go ahead. Is that cool if I jump in? Adrian, you haven't spoken. Do you want?
Go for it.
Okay. So I think this might be unpopular here, but I actually do think that there's a difference. I don't, I see obviously that they are still the head of empire and that remains the same, but there are differences. And one of the primary difference that I see, again, and I'll say this over and over, is that there is something in holding the liberal contradiction, right? The liberal veneer of, some sort of order, or you know what it is? It's a fidelity to process. It's a fidelity to procedural equality, as opposed to substantive equality, right? It's the idea that everybody gets their day in court, that there is due process, right? Taking for granted that we're never equal once we get to that stage. But because of that commitment, which I think is very hypocritical, but at the core of liberalism, it creates better organizing conditions and more space for us to be able to organize. I say this as a Palestinian in the heart of empire who is committed to many, multiple struggles for liberation, and specifically on the question of Palestine, how much space had been shrunk in the particular struggle for Palestine, as just by way of example. I gave you the example of the IHRA definition. I already had a lawsuit filed against me, a Title VI lawsuit, when I gave my book talk. I didn't even do anything. I gave the book talk. So talk about the criminalization, or people that we already seen how academics have been punished when they speak out against Zionism. We see now in almost all 50 states, I think the number is now 44 out of the 50 states and the occupied state of Hawaii, BDS, anti-BDS legislation that either denies you gainful employment if it's going to be public funding by the state, or denies you opportunity, as was denied humanitarian relief to survivors of the hurricane in Houston, right? If you supported BDS. So the space had been shrunk, and that's to say nothing of the attacks on the lives of Palestinians on the ground by the move of the embassy, by the withdrawal of $364 million of humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees, by wanting to remove the moniker that they were even refugees in order to erase them altogether. Obviously, Biden is not going to move the embassy back, but he will reinstate the humanitarian relief. And because of a commitment to First Amendment speech, creates the opportunity for us to organize. And that's all we have, right? Is the ability to organize ourselves. We have no saviors. We are not waiting for anybody. There's nobody that we can elect. Even Bernie wouldn't have fixed this, right? Bernie was an avid two-stater. Bernie was considered radical because he recognized that the 2 million Palestinians trapped in the Gaza Strip now for 15 years in inadequate living conditions that the World Health Organization says is unlivable. He said that they were human, and people went crazy. How far do you think he was going to go against Zionism, right? So that all we have is ourselves, and what we organize for, I think, in electoral politics is the space to organize under better conditions. I know that's not popular, but I'm committed to that. And then on the last thing, somebody mentioned Frantz Fanon in the feed, and I just want to say that, the rereading Frantz Fanon, right, at a time of the Algerian revolution against French settler colonialism, was a reminder that the European model of sovereignty wasn't inevitable, right? So this idea that our conditions are not inevitable, we can create anew. Not to divert, but I meant to say that earlier.
Yeah, I'll try to tackle some of these. The question of representation. I know a lot of people have discussed the matter of identity politics throughout this panel. For me, it's more of a question of what is the system that they're representing in, right? How do we tackle what actually they're representing, right? It doesn't matter to me if the person is queer or a person of color, a Black person in like a high position in office, if the system that they're representing is inherently one that is upholding imperialism, white supremacy, and so to me, there are so many other great examples of representation of people who are in people's organizations, people who are fighting back. And so I just would want to reframe that. Why aren't we looking towards people's own power structures that are alternatives to the current capitalist power structure, and finding inspiration in that, and looking towards representation in that, and seeing those people as what we can aspire to be, right? As not folks who have to compromise things, but folks who are uncompromising in their fight against the status quo. Toward the last question, I think, you know, maybe our points of analysis differ here, but it's not so much a question, you know, the question of space, democratic space, I think is an interesting one, because I think it's a question of where do these sites of intense or overt struggles move, right? If it's not going to be in the US with neo-fascists, you know, running across the streets, where do they move to then? Where do they move if a Biden administration is passing tons of neoliberal policies, re-entering into free trade agreements that maybe Trump, because of his, I don't want to call it isolationist policy because he was still, you know, very much an imperialist, but he pulled out of a lot of things, a lot of agreements. Where do they move, right? I am not convinced that peasant farmer, for example, in the Philippines or elsewhere around the world, will feel any difference now that Biden is at the head of US empire, when they are protesting against rights liberalization that might even get worse under a Biden administration. We know that Obama's, you know, the crisis at the border as a kind of indication of a shrinking of democratic space for the immigrant, migrant, undocumented community here in the US. That site of struggle was in the neoliberal attacks all across Central America and Latin America under Obama, before Trump came into office, right? So I think it's more so about, of course, imperialism is affecting communities here in the US, neoliberalism is affecting us here in the US, but I think having a more, paying attention to where these sites of struggle will be under Biden will be important.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna just pose one final question to our panel before we move to our closing for tonight's program. This has just been really wonderful. And I wish I could ask so many more questions that people posed in the chat and to folks, but you know, I'm an organizer. This is, you know, Dissenters is a movement organization. So we have to end this panel by asking folks to just speak on what do you see as some winning strategies for weakening US empire and for growing our movement to resist? And if folks want to speak on just any ways that folks can be taking action in this moment.
Well, I see in the chat some people are saying join an organization, and I think that is in fact key. I'm so grateful to Dissenters for putting this panel together and for the work that they have embraced. It's so incredibly important to see folks who understand the absolute necessity for us to bring back into the center of discourse the issue of imperialism, and to encourage people to embrace an anti-imperialist position. It is a major contradiction in this country for people to be able to identify themselves as so-called radicals, but yet not ever say a mumbling word about US imperialism. So that's one thing that we have to do, that we have a responsibility, I believe, being at the center of empire, to in fact be in solidarity with the struggling people around the globe. Understanding that in that kind of solidarity, it only strengthens all of us, that we're not going to be able to address the contradictions we're facing in the US while understanding that we're part of one global system, and that we've got to be in solidarity with all people who are struggling against our common enemy. And we share a common vision in terms of where we need to go as collective humanity. So we say in the Black is Back Coalition and the Black Alliance for Peace that we must turn imperialist wars into wars against imperialism. And the only way we do that, my friends, is by organizing ourselves and doing the deep base building work that we've been suggesting and implying here this evening. So support and join Dissenters, support and join the Black Alliance for Peace, get into organizations, take up the task of engaging our people in political dialogue, communicate the responsibility that we all have to be organized, but also help everyone to understand that organized, conscious, it may be a cliche, but the people are undefeated. And that sense of inspiration, that sense of our task is something we've got to talk about. We've got to center that and tell people that the degradation and dehumanization that we are subjected to in this backward and barbaric system, it can't be altered, can't be eliminated. That there is, in fact, a difference, that we can transcend this. So let's inspire each other, support each other, and let's communicate to the people that, in fact, you know, we can win.
Can I just piggyback on that? And I'm kind of fading here, so I just say just a few things. 100% agreement, and I just want to say three things. One, I also want to support what Noura said about the space that's created. Yes, none of us love the Biden-Harris, and we know that they both have really questionable backgrounds as individual legislators and prosecutors. But there's this. But some things happen as a result, not of them, but as a result of all the organizing that many of you did before there was Dissenters and other organizations. I know Asha, as young as she is a veteran for the time she was about 3 years old. I know that for a fact, as is Asha Ramsey-Sporn, the one I know. And what we do know is that some things we gotta admit are better than they were. The commitment to a $15 minimum wage, some kind of limited, problematic, still commitment to a green economy. You know, there's, you know, the fact that we're seeing some changes in foreign policy that were slightly better than before in terms of rolling back certain legislation. That's not our savior. That doesn't undercut the neoliberal plan, but what it does do is it does two things. It creates space for more organizing. Maybe, I'm gonna say one thing about that. But then the second thing it does is that it gives us confidence that movements, you know, history keeps being rewritten as if somehow legislators make these changes. They don't. Movements make these changes. The Biden Harris, I have no interest in $15 minimum, you know, and part of bringing all these Black and brown people into the administration is to occlude or hide the fact that they're not interested in that. But some things we have to admit are victories for the short term. But the short term, long term strategy also, we have to be concerned about the way that counterterrorism against white supremacists will be used against us. And Noura is absolutely right that, you know, we saw this in 1947 under the Truman administration when, you know, the Truman administration had a special committee of 15 people put out a statement that said, racist violence has to stop and we need more legislation to do it. And what they do, they expanded the carceral state, they expanded surveillance, they expanded police. And Naomi Murakawa wrote a whole book about this called The First Civil Right. And I think we've got to be really careful because, again, remember, the most radical movements that we've seen in the last half century or more, century, have been not against right-wing regimes in the United States. They've been against liberal regimes, against Roosevelt, right? Franklin Roosevelt, against Lyndon Johnson, you know? I mean, in other words, we've got to be leery of them and be prepared to fight, but also know that that we're ready for a fight, you know, and you're all ready for a fight. So I just want to say that much, and not to give them credit for it, but to give all y'all credit for the changes that we will see, and also to protect ourselves from more surveillance, more repression in the name of fighting white supremacy.
Yeah, I will say, that in terms of space created, I think the space that we are to create is going to be the ones that again, like everyone's mentioned, the people create, the mass movement creates from the cracks, the cracks in the ruling class that are coming more and more to the front, right? So how do we actually take those opportunities to create that space? I agree that, organization is key. There have been so many successful revolutions across the world where strong people's organization has been the key, right? We're in a situation where in the latest election, I think it was the highest voter turnout, despite all of the voter suppression and disenfranchisement, which means that masses of people were mobilized to vote for people's issues, bread and butter issues that matter to them. And so how are we able to take these, link them, raise them, conduct the political education that we need to do to the broader fight against neoliberalism, to imperialism, and raise that level of analysis to help them understand that we cannot settle for reforms and concessions, whether here in the US or at the expense of the exploitation and militarization that's happening across the world. And so it's going to take patience. It's going to take an aggressiveness to it. And it's going to take us being able to, again, say things clearly. I really resonate with that point, to not speak over people's head, to not alienate ourselves from people just because they might not see through the facade of US imperialism just yet. It's painstaking, it's long-term work, but we have to do it. And we have to use that organization not just to study things with each other, study theory, and then be content with knowing the world. We study the world to change the world. And so we need to build people's organizations, mass movements to fight. There's a quote that a lot of Filipino activists, young activists, return to a lot, and it's only through militant struggle can the best in the youth emerge. Meaning to say that only in finding ourselves in the place of that class struggle can we actually bring our best selves forward. And so, encouraging everyone here on the panel tonight, whether you're young, whether you have experience organizing, to join organizations, any of the ones represented here, find the org that you are nervous to join or you feel intimidated. Trust you, it is a learning process. You don't have to know everything about organizing to start organizing, right? And just, I'd be remiss to not mention this, but since the question is on what are winning strategies to weaken US empire, we have to highlight that some of the most direct challenges to US empire are coming from those who are actively countering the violence of imperialism, the violence of the imperialist state, with revolutionary self-defense and revolutionary armed struggle. And so in places like Kurdistan, in places like Palestine, in West Papua, in India, in countries like the Philippines, there are revolutionary wars that are raging on and that we have to learn about. We have to educate people about. In the Philippines in particular, there are 90% of the provinces in the country, there are armed guerrilla fronts, armed guerrilla fights happening against US imperialism and their local puppet regimes. They are creating people's governments. They are taking land back quite literally and beating the enemy one fight at a time, amassing armed strength one gun at a time. And so if there's anyone to take inspiration from, I really think it's the people who, despite having the military might of US imperialism crushing them, weighing down on them, breathing down their backs, choose to fight back nonetheless.
Great. Thank you all so much for those closing words. This has been really just such a wonderful conversation. Thank you to the folks who are here and in the chat. We're not done just yet. I'm gonna just pass it to Kay, who is a Dissenters youth organizer based in Chicago, to close us on out tonight.
Hey, hi everyone. I don't even know how to follow up all of that. That was amazing. I learned a lot. I'm very inspired by everyone. And yeah, I just want to say that I feel a lot of joy right now, and not joy because of this new administration, but joy because of us, right? Because of all the work that's being done, all the things that are being learned, that are being taught, that are yet to come. And yeah, I'm just really excited to see like what what comes of this, right? And then I also want to take some time to just, reflect on just yesterday. It was a lot for me. I know there was a lot of people telling young people that our radical politics are kind of killing their joy, and it's hard to kind of empathize with that. How can you feel joy when there's a whole new brand of war criminals that are coming in that may not be as blatant as Trump was, that are just as harmful, right? Or whatever your analysis is. And I think that when it comes to young people in these spaces, folks need to be more reflective of how they treat us, just because, again, like we are, dissenters are the ones that were hosting this. Dissenters are the ones who are, a lot of us are in the front lines in different movements, not just in, anti-militarism and anti-war work. And I think that folks need to kind of start seeing us as educators, start seeing us as teachers, because that's what we are, right? We're facilitating conversations, we're leading these movements, just in Chicago, right? Like, young people are so amazing, and I'm always so happy and proud to just, be part of the Chicago youth movement, always. And yeah, I just really just want to say how joyful I feel. But yeah, also recognizing that, young people are in this movement too. And so I really want to encourage everyone, when you see a young person, asking for funds, give them funds, retweet their tweets, share their GoFundMes, because supporting youth isn't just, joining these panels and, kind of tokenizing us, right? It's about materially supporting us and making sure that our movement is being supported. And again, yeah, just whenever you see a young person, especially Black and Brown and Indigenous folks, make sure that you are actually supporting us, because we don't have any more time for reform, right? We don't have time to sit around and wait until these politicians decide when they want to, create reforms that may actually help us a little bit, right? My community members don't have time. People who have fallen from police violence don't have time. People who have died from militarism don't have time. We don't have time to sit around and wait and see when these Democrats are, gonna finally do something for us, right? We have to do it for us because no one is, right? And so you need to start supporting us, so that way we can make sure that we continue to do this work, and we continue to make sure that other young people come into this work. Because again, like I've seen, no one is gonna do this work for me, right? This isn't about just wanting to join something. It's about my survival. It's about the survival of my family. It's about the survival of my people, of communities that I stand in solidarity with, of communities that I'm in community with, about all the youth in the centers. This is what this is about, right? We don't have time for reform anymore. It isn't about reform. Like, the funding is just one step to abolition, because abolition is, the key, and then we can talk about what comes after that. But we really have to keep in mind that supporting young people is about, material, right? We want to make sure that we are checking in with each other. It's about daily practice. How are we treating each other? How are we treating our community? How are we being accountable to our community, right? We have to let ego go and kind of, just like observe community, because community is what has kept us going. Community is what has led all of us to this space, right? Yeah, I don't even know if that makes sense. But yeah, I just wanted to leave everyone with that. Community is key, and we don't have time for reform at all. Support our youth. And I also have this link to these kind of commitments from Miriam Kaba on how to stand in solidarity with folks who are incarcerated, because we know how intertwined militarism is with the prison industrial complex, and abolition is what's going to make sure that these structures fall and stay fallen, and that we can build a world that we all deserve, a world where Black and Brown people and Indigenous folks and all colonized people can just live with peace, right? So we can just rest, because we have not been able to rest since the start of time. So yeah, I just really wanted to leave this with y'all. And yeah, I think the Dissenters is also going to have a training for young people, I think in March, so stay tuned for that. Follow our social media. And yeah, just if y'all also want to drop some stuff in the chat, mutual aid stuff, anything you want, go ahead, right? We're all here to support each other. That's what community is about. No matter how far away we are from each other, we are in this together, and we have to be accountable to what community is, because we know that Democrats are not accountable to us. Republicans are not, nobody is except for us. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kay, for that statement. Again, just as you were saying, to reiterate, we do not have time, right? So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Noura, Robin, Ajamu, and Adrian for joining us and for allowing us to engage in this conversation together and for this meaningful discussion. Adrian, you stated this beautifully, but we study the world to change the world, right? So let this be the beginning. Let this conversation be the beginning, or just another step, right, in your own movement towards changing the world. And hopefully we can all come together, continue to act, collectively organize to do that. So again, links in the chat if y'all want to check that out from various people. We really can't thank you enough for joining.
Oh, before you leave, can you tell us where's your donate button?
Could you say that again?
Oh yeah, could you tell us where's your donate button for those of us who want to give money to the movement? Yes. Do you have one, like on a website or something?
Yes, I believe you can go to you can go to wearedissenters.org/donate. Folks should also have probably received that link in one of the emails you got in lead up to this program. So thank you.
Thank you.
And Asha will be on the program with the Black Alliance of Peace on January 26th. So look out for that link and please join us.
Great. Thanks everyone so much. This was wonderful. Have a great night.
Oh, can I drop something in?
Of course you can, Asha.
So UIC Dissenters, we're having a mutual aid project where we're donating to a housing encampment. We don't ask, like, it's not charity, it's solidarity. So we directly ask like what they need. And our goal is to try and get them housing because Chicago is cold and it's freezing and the city is not doing enough. They basically abandoned them to death and, you know, they're letting them freeze to death. So we just want to really try to help these people get housed because encampments, like this is a result of capitalism, how like rent should not be a thing. Rent is, it's a myth. I don't believe in it. So we need to get these people housed like ASAP. Oh, drop my Twitter. Oh, sure. It's Asha_2A. But yeah, thank you. Just want to throw that out there. Okay, that's all. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.